The brief, limited respite in Russia's assault on Ukraine's energy supply is over. And with no respite from the assault of winter, Ukraine's civilians used again as Russia's pressure point. Overnight, Ukraine says Russia sent more than 70 missiles and 450 drones into its territory, non-military sites, apartment buildings and heating plants among the targets struck. 5 regions were hit. This was the northeastern city of Sumy, where a child was pulled from a burning building. In nearby Kharkiv region, 60% of households were left without electricity. Hundreds of thousands of families in the country denied heating in temperatures as low as minus 20 Celsius. The so-called energy ceasefire over almost before it began.
At first they said it will last for a week, then 3 days, and then here you go. Well, they did hit hard. What should people do now? Where should they live?
There is always hope. Everybody hopes that maybe the situation will get better, that the war will end. But no. As we see, there is nothing like this in the foreseeable future. The Russians use this weather to terrorize the civilian population.
Overnight, hope on offer from Donald Trump, saying they were doing well with Russia and Ukraine for the first time, talking up a recent call with President Putin.
And I asked him if he wouldn't shoot for a period of 1 week, no missiles going into Kiev or any other towns, and he's agreed to do it, so it's something.
About an hour later came the drones and missiles slamming into towns and cities across the country. Ukraine's President Zelensky had himself said yesterday that Russia appeared largely to be observing the energy ceasefire. Today he held a regional response call after the biggest Russian strike on the energy sector so far this year. On X, he said it was a deliberate attack against energy infrastructure involving a record number of ballistic missiles. In fact, the Russian army exploited the US proposal to briefly halt strikes, not to support diplomacy, but to stockpile missiles and wait until the coldest days of the year. Hosting the NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte today, Zelensky also said Ukraine's negotiating team, heading for talks with the US and Russia in Abu Dhabi tomorrow, would adjust their work accordingly. The first round of direct talks in Abu Dhabi took place less than 2 weeks ago. The Financial Times reporting today that progress has been made without Russia on one significant part of any future ceasefire, a multi-layered plan for a Western response to any breach of the ceasefire by Russia that would, at the upper range, involve US military action. For now, Ukraine's people left having to endure. Some solace to be found in hot meals served in the freezing cold, served to people like Yulia, looking after her children while her husband fights on the front line.
I'm not the only one like this in the country right now. All day long, there is no electricity, no way to cook food for the kids. Pretty much everyone is in this situation. Even when our building has heating, when I wake up in the morning, it's 10 or 12 degrees in the apartment, and I see ice on the windowsills.
Yulia and her children among millions who can only wait and hope for the bombing to stop, or, more realistically perhaps, for the winter to end. Well, joining us now from Stockholm is Dr. Neil Melvin, Director of International Security at the Royal United Services Institute. Thanks very much for joining us. So last night from the Oval Office, we had Donald Trump talking about the prospect of good news, things going well in terms of talks with Russia and Ukraine, talking about the energy ceasefire that he'd had Putin agree to. And literally minutes later, this enormous strike on energy infrastructure in Ukraine. What do we make of that?
But the reality is that the war continues. And even though there may have been a short pause, perhaps, in the Russian attacks, this hasn't pivoted into a sort of confidence building measure, as some people, I think, interpret it might be, that would then lead to a final agreement. In fact, we just resumed the attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure at the time that the country is most vulnerable. I mean, temperatures now below minus 20, so clearly it's targeting suffering of the civilians. So it doesn't really feel that Russia is ready at this point to move away from plan A, which is to continue to prosecute the war.
And we have seen this pattern from Vladimir Putin before, very soon after apparently making some kind of accommodation with the White House, a very different story on the ground in Ukraine. What does it say about Trump's influence with his opposite number in the Kremlin?
Well, I mean, I think, as I say, I mean, the assumption must be at this point that Russia is actually, it's sort of talking but not negotiating. It's trying to drag out the peace process, as Donald Trump has called it. But the reality is that Russia continues to see an opportunity to actually defeat Ukraine.
And nonetheless, there are these next rounds of talks in Abu Dhabi between the US, Russia and Ukraine, scheduled to start tomorrow, Wednesday. President Zelensky saying that they will adjust their work accordingly, the Ukrainian negotiators, after this incident overnight. What can we expect out of those, do you think?
Well, I mean, this is the second round. I mean, and there is, as I say, some optics around the negotiations that look a little bit more positive. The Russian delegation has got slightly upgraded. But the reality is that two sort of key issues, interwoven issues, remain unresolved. One is the territorial question, which is, will Ukraine be willing to give up the 20% of the Donetsk region, which it currently holds and is often called the fortress belt? It's the primary means by which Ukraine is able to defeat Russian attempts to break through. And then secondly, Ukraine has not been ready to give up any territory, particularly the fortress belt, if there aren't these so-called concrete security guarantees, primarily from the United States. Now, Ukraine has said that those agreements are ready to go, but we don't have a signature. Behind all this, I think, is a real question about whether Ukraine can actually trust those security guarantees.
On that point, there is this report in the Financial Times today from their very well-sourced correspondent in Kyiv that there is this agreement for a multi-layered security guarantee arrangement that, in the initial stage of a Russian breach of a ceasefire, there would be some sort of diplomatic warning, then intervention by or action by a coalition of the willing troops, all the way up to, if it got to that level, a US military commitment as well. I mean, would that kind of arrangement track? Would that work?
The difficulty is it's been spoken of as an Article 5-like arrangement, the NATO Article 5, namely the sort of the one for all idea. But what's written on paper has to be backed up by a belief that actually the countries will deliver on this. It's not an automatic process. There will always be considerations about what type of forces to commit, when to commit them, and in what way. And this is the difficulty, I think, for the Ukrainians, is can they trust Trump? Up until now, of course, the US has not been willing to commit forces. Before Trump, Biden made that clear as well. So the Ukrainians need to make a judgment call as to whether this is actually going to be not just in Trump's interest, but in long-term US interests. And up to now, we haven't really seen that commitment from Washington. Does
Zelensky need to look elsewhere for security guarantees? Would a NATO without US security guarantee be enough, given the capacities currently of those members without American involvement?
At this point, I think it would be very unlikely that the Europeans could commit to holding Russia on their own. But I think the Europeans are also very nervous. They didn't want to commit to Ukraine unless they had this, what's been called this US backstop. And so this is going to be the worry, that we're not going to have a serious European force, and the Americans are also not going to be backstopping that.
All right, Dr. Melvin, thank you very much for your time today.